Hey everyone and welcome back. Tonight we're going to travel through one of history's most amazing stories, the rise and fall of the British Empire. For over 300 years, this small island nation ruled almost one-quarter of the world's land and ruled nearly one-third of all people. It was an empire so huge that the sun never set on its lands, reaching from the icy shores of Canada to the hot deserts of Australia. But how did a rainy island off the coast of Europe come to rule the whole world? And why did this empire that seemed impossible to beat finally break apart? Tonight, we'll look at the big dreams, the cruel actions, the smart ideas, and the proud mistakes of the greatest empire the world has ever known. So get comfortable, turn down the lights, and let me tell you the story of how Britain took over the world and why it could not keep it forever. Every empire starts with a dream, and Britain's dream began with the sea. Surrounded by the gray-green oceans that both kept it safe and kept it trapped, this small group of islands sat like a fortress off the coast of Europe, close enough to smell the smoke from wars on the mainland, far enough away to watch them burn without danger. In the early 1600s, Britain was not the boss of anything except its own beaches. It was a group of kingdoms that often fought each other. England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland were usually at war with each other, often attacked by foreign armies, and made money by selling wool to Dutch buyers. The idea that this rainy, fog-covered island would one day rule India, Australia, and half of Africa would have sounded like a crazy person's dream. But the sea that surrounded Britain was not just a wall. It was a road, and the English, maybe because they had no other choice, learned to use that road better than anyone else in the world. The big change started with one act of bravery. In 1588, when the Spanish Armada, 130 ships carrying 30,000 men, sailed up the English Channel like a floating city built for war, it looked impossible to stop. Spain was the strongest country of the time, owner of the Americas, controller of the world's silver mines, the fighting arm of Catholic Europe. But the English had something the Spanish did not expect. They were desperate and they had new ideas. Their ships were smaller, faster, and easier to turn. Their captains were pirates who had become patriots, men like Francis Drake, who had learned to fight by stealing Spanish treasure. When the two groups of ships met in the narrow waters off the English coast, it was not just a battle between navies. It was a fight between two different ways of thinking about the world. The Spanish fought like soldiers trying to get on enemy ships and fight hand-to-hand. The English fought like traders, staying far away and using their cannons to smash the enemy. It was the difference between old-fashioned night fighting and modern war, between honor and getting the job done. When the storms came and broke up the Spanish fleet, the English said it was help from God. Maybe it was, or maybe it was just the first sign that the future belonged not to the biggest armies, but to the people who could change fastest. The defeat of the Armada was more than a war win. It was a change in how people thought. For the first time, the English started to see themselves not as a small European kingdom on the edge, but as a future sea power. The sea, which had once been their prison, became their road to the world. Queen Elizabeth I understood this change right away. She started to support English privateers, which were really legal pirates, to attack Spanish treasure ships coming back from the Americas. Men like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh became national heroes, bringing home Spanish gold and stories of faraway lands ready to be taken. But it was the creation of joint stock companies that really started the British Empire. These were something brand new in the world, private companies with the power to fight wars, make treaties, and rule lands. They were business armed with cannons, trade backed by fighting. The Muscovy Company, started in 1555, opened trade with Russia through the icy Arctic seas. The Levant Company, started in 1592, traded with the Ottoman Empire, bringing back silk and spices from the mysterious East. And in 1600, the most important one of all was created, the East India Company. The East India Company's motto was simple: trade follows the flag. But in real life, it was often the other way around. The flag followed trade. The company's first trip to India in 1601 was a small one. 4 ships carrying English wool and hoping to come back with Indian spices. But it started a relationship that would change both Britain and India, making one the boss of the world and turning the other into a colony. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, English settlers were starting small towns in the New World. Jamestown, started in 1607, was a disaster. Most of the settlers died from sickness and hunger. The town survived by the smallest chance, kept alive by growing tobacco and the cruel use of enslaved Africans. The Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620 were running away from religious trouble, not looking for an empire. But they brought with them something stronger than armies: the English language, English law, and English ideas about owning things, government, and personal rights. These ideas would spread across the continent like seeds blown by the wind, growing in land that had never known European ways. By 1650, England had started colonies in Virginia, Massachusetts, Maryland, and the Caribbean islands of Barbados and Jamaica. These were not yet the best parts of a world empire. They were struggling. Towns on the edge of the known world, always in danger from sickness, hunger, and unfriendly neighbors. But they showed something new: the planned settling of faraway lands by a European country. The Spanish had taken huge lands in the Americas, but they had done it mostly to take gold and silver. The English were different. They came to stay, to build new towns, to make new Englands in faraway places. This difference would help the empire win in the end. Spanish colonies stayed dependent on the main country, existing mostly to make Spain rich. English colonies, on the other hand, built their own money-making ways, their own rules, their own ways of life. They became parts of England, not just things England owned. The English also proved better at changing than their rivals. Where the Spanish forced their culture and religion on the people they beat, the English were more practical. They were ready to work with local leaders, to use local ways when it helped them, to rule without being there directly by using the people already in power. This practical way was born because they had to. England simply did not have enough people or money to rule huge lands directly, but it became a strength, letting the English control much bigger areas with far fewer soldiers than their rivals. By the end of the 1600s, the building blocks of the British Empire were ready. The Royal Navy was becoming the strongest fleet in the world. English traders were doing business in every ocean. English settlers were spreading across North America and the Caribbean. And the East India Company was starting its takeover of India. The time was ready for the biggest growth in human history. But first, Britain had to become Britain. In 1707, something amazing happened in the government buildings in London and Edinburgh. Two old enemies, England and Scotland, decided to become one country. The Act of Union created Great Britain, and with it, the political base for the greatest empire the world had ever seen. But this joining was not from love or the same feelings. It was from smart thinking, need, and wanting things from each other. Scotland broke after a failed try to start its own colony in Panama, needed English money. England, worried about a Scotland that might team up with France, needed Scotland to be on its side. The joining was set up like a business deal, talked about in smoky rooms by men who knew that feelings were something they could not waste time on. Scottish lords were paid with English gold. English leaders were promised Scottish help, and the normal people of both countries were mostly not asked. Yet from this cold start came something wonderful. The joining of England and Scotland made a new kind of country, one that was both old and new, keeping traditions and trying new things, careful and bold. It was a country that could use the business skill of England and the smart thinking of Scotland, the sea traditions of the South, and the fighting skill of the North. The Scots, who had been England's enemies for hundreds of years, became the empire's most excited builders. Scottish builders made the roads and bridges that joined the empire. Scottish doctors and teachers went across the colonies, bringing learning and medicine to the farthest places in the world. Scottish soldiers fought in every empire war, their kilts and bagpipes becoming signs of British power from the Scottish hills to the Himalayas. But the Union also made something darker, a feeling of being better than others because of race and culture that would make people accept hundreds of years of taking advantage and hurting others. The British started to see themselves not just as winners, but as naturally better than other peoples. They were Protestant in a Catholic world, civilized among people they called barbarians, free among people they called slaves. This feeling of being better was made stronger by the Enlightenment, the big thinking movement that swept through 1700s Britain. Thinkers like Adam Smith, David Hume, and Edmund Burke made ideas about money, government, and people that seemed to explain why Britain won and made British growth seem right. Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, said that free trade and competition would naturally bring wealth and improvement. This became the thinking base for British money-based empire building. The idea that letting British goods into world markets was not just good for money, but good for all people. Edmund Burke's writings on government. And people gave a deep reason for British rule over people they thought were not ready. The British, Burke said, had a duty to rule those who could not rule themselves, to bring civilization to the uncivilized, to bring order to mess. These ideas were not just school thoughts. They became the main rules of the British Empire. Every takeover was called a mission to civilize. Every taking advantage was called helping the economy. Every cruel act was called needed teaching. But the real power behind British growth was not thinking. It was war. The 1700s was a time of almost never-ending fighting as European countries battled for control in Europe, America, and Asia. And in these wars, Britain found its biggest strength, the ability to fight on many places at once while its enemies were stuck on land. The 7 Years' War, fought from 1756 to 1763, was the first real world war in history. It was fought on 3 continents and in every ocean, from the forests of North America to the plains of India, from the Caribbean islands to the coasts of Africa. In North America, British and colonial soldiers took Quebec and Montreal, ending French rule in Canada. The death of General James Wolfe on the Plains of Abraham became a famous story, a young hero dying right when he won. His last words were said to be, "Now God be praised. I will die in peace." In India, Robert Clive's win at the Battle of Plassey in 1757 gave the East India Company Bengal, the richest area in India. It was a battle won not by better fighting plans, but by better cheating. Clive had paid the enemy's generals to change sides at the key moment. In the Caribbean, British soldiers took the French sugar islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique, adding their wealth to the growing empire money. In Africa, British traders set up new places along the coast, feeding the growing need for enslaved workers in the American colonies. The Peace of Paris in 1763 showed Britain as the world's strongest power. France gave up Canada and all its North American lands east of the Mississippi River. Spain, which had fought with France, gave up Florida. Britain now ruled the eastern half of North America and was the clear boss of India. But winning came with a cost that would later hurt the empire's togetherness. The war had cost Britain £140 million, more than the government made in a whole year. The country owed twice as much money and leaders were desperate to find new money. The clear answer was to tax the American colonies, which had been kept safe by Britain during the war. The Stamp Act of 1765 made colonists pay a tax on all printed things, newspapers, legal papers, playing cards, even dice. It seemed fair to British leaders. The colonists should pay for their own protection. But the colonists saw it differently. They had no one speaking for them in Parliament. So how could Parliament tax them? No taxation. Without representation became the shout of American anger. What started as a fight over taxes grew into a big problem about the rules, then into fighting with weapons, and finally into a war to be free that would break the empire apart. The American Revolution was Britain's first big empire failure, but it was also a lesson. Losing the 13 colonies was more than losing a war. It was a shock that made the British think again about their whole way of running an empire. The old way of letting colonies have local groups and leaders had not worked. The new way would be direct rule, trained workers, and huge army power. The empire that came out of the American Revolution would be more in the center, better run, and meaner than anything before. But it would also be easier to break because it would be held together not by the same feelings and shared good things, but by fear and force alone. After the American Revolution, Britain had to choose something that would shape the next 100 years of history. It could give up on empire, saying losing America proved faraway lands were too costly and dangerous to keep, or it could try even harder, using the lessons from losing to build an even bigger empire. Britain chose empire, but this new empire would be different from the old one. It would be built not by people looking for new homes, but by traders looking for new customers, not by soldiers taking land, but by workers ruling people, not by the sword alone, but by money books and the steam engine. The East India Company became the test place for this new kind of empire building. What had started as a trading group had grown into something never seen in history, a private company that ruled more people than lived in all of Europe. The company's workers were not just traders. They were soldier rulers, men who fought wars in the morning and did money work in the afternoon. In India, the company found a huge land in trouble. The Mughal Empire, which had once ruled most of India with great beauty, was falling apart like a house made of sand. Local leaders fought each other for land and power, while French and English traders fought for business wins. It was a perfect chance for men with big dreams, loose rules, and better guns. Robert Clive was this new kind of empire businessman. A clerk who became a soldier, he knew that in the New World, business and taking over were the same thing. At the Battle of Plassey in 1757, Clive's small army of 3,000 men beat the Nawab of Bengal's army of 50,000. It was not better plans that won the day, it was better cheating. Clive had paid the Nawab's generals to switch sides at the important moment. The win at Plassey gave the East India Company control of Bengal, the richest part of India. Suddenly, a trading company was ruling 20 million people and collecting taxes from a place bigger than Britain itself. The money that came from Bengal would pay for Britain's wars against Napoleon and help pay for the Industrial Revolution that was changing the British Islands. But the company's win hurt India very badly. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed 10 million people, one-third of the area's people. Company workers who wanted the most money for owners in London had not listened to warnings of bad crops and kept asking for taxes even as people died of hunger in the streets. This was the dark side of the new empire building, turning people into numbers for money, treating whole groups of people as ways to make profit. The company's rulers did not think they were mean bosses. They thought they were smart managers using science rules for running a country. Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General of India, tried to fix the company's rules and stop the worst bad things. But he was fighting against a system made for taking, not for ruling well. Company workers were paid very little, but were supposed to get rich from their own trading and cheating. The result was stealing on a scale that is hard to believe. When Hastings went back to London, he was put on trial by Parliament for what he did in India. The trial lasted 7 years and was a big story, with Edmund Burke giving speeches that went on for days, talking about the company's crimes against people. But Hastings was finally found not guilty, and the system he had tried to fix stayed the same. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution was turning Britain into something the world had never seen. A country that could make things faster and cheaper than anyone else, then use its navy power to force open markets all over the world. It was business with guns, free trade forced with weapons. Steam engines pumped water from coal mines, letting people dig deeper and get more coal. Steam-powered cloth factories made cloth faster than groups of people weaving by hand. Steam trains carried things across the country at never-before speeds. And steam-powered ships let Britain travel without waiting for wind or good weather, letting them go all year to every part of the world. The change could be seen everywhere. Manchester, once a quiet market town, became a loud factory city of cloth mills and smoking chimneys. The air was full of soot, the rivers ran black with factory waste, and the workers lived in poor areas that shocked even tough people. But the factories ran day and night, making cloth that cost less than work done by hand everywhere. British factories could make things so cheaply that they ruined local work across the world. Indian weavers who had once made fine cotton cloth for the world could not sell against machine-made cloth from Manchester. The sad part was clear. Indian cotton was sent to Britain made into cloth, then sold back to India at prices that killed the local cloth work. This way, taking raw things from colonies and selling them back as finished things became the base of the empire money system. Australia gave wool, Canada gave wood, the Caribbean gave sugar, and India gave cotton and indigo. All of these things were made into products in British factories and sold around the world for huge money. The Royal Navy made this system work with tough control. British warships watched every ocean, keeping British traders safe and scaring others. The Navy's job was easy to say: keep the sea roads open for British trade and closed to everyone else when needed. The Opium Wars with China showed this system perfectly. The Chinese Empire, proud and able to take care of itself, did not want many British-made things. The Chinese had silk, tea, and porcelain that Europeans wanted badly, but they did not need European things back. This made a trade problem that took silver out of Britain. But British traders had found one thing that Chinese people wanted badly: opium grown in British-controlled India. The drug business was very money-making. Opium cost almost nothing to grow, but sold for huge amounts in Chinese markets. soon. Millions of Chinese were hooked, and silver was flowing out of China to pay for the drug. When the Chinese government tried to stop opium coming in to save its people from the drug, Britain went to war to protect the drug trade. The First Opium War, fought from 1839 to 1842, ended with China forced to give Hong Kong to Britain and opened 5 ports to British trade. The Second Opium War from 1856 to 1860 forced China to let opium in legally and open even more ports. It was empire building at its worst, using army power to make a free country accept a trade that was hurting its people. But from the British view, it was just business. Free trade was a good thing, and anyone who said no was stopping progress and civilization. The same thinking was used everywhere the British flag was raised. In Australia, Aboriginal people were pushed off their lands to make room for sheep farms. In Canada, Native American tribes were forced onto small areas to make way for trains and towns. In Africa, old ways of life were broken to make new markets for British things and new places to get raw things. But the British did not see themselves as takers or bullies. They saw themselves as bringers of better ways, bringing progress and light to people they thought were behind. They built trains and telegraphs, started schools and hospitals, brought law and order to messy places. The fact that these good things mostly helped British needs was, in their minds, not the main point. This was the smart part and the sad part of the British Empire. It was both breaking things and making things, hurting and improving. The same system that made millions poor also joined them to the world money system. The same rulers who took wealth also built roads and buildings. The same soldiers who took lands also stopped fighting between local groups. By the middle of the 1800s, Britain had done something never seen in history: world control based not just on army wins, but on money and machine power. The empire was starting to pay for itself, making the money needed to keep the armies and navies that guarded it. But this control was built on problems that would finally pull it apart. The more the empire won, the more it made the things that would destroy it. The schools it built made local leaders who knew both Western ideas and local problems. The money growth it started made new groups of people with money to fight back. The talking networks it made let anti-empire ideas spread faster than ever. The empire was at its highest point, but the things that would finally destroy it were already moving in the dark. Of all the places that flew the Union Jack, none was more important to British dreams than India. It was the jewel in the crown, the place Britain got its wealth and power, the proof of its mission to civilize. But India was also the empire's biggest problem, a land of old wisdom ruled by foreign traders, a civilization older than Britain itself, turned into a colony. The change of India from trading friend to empire land was slow, almost by accident. The East India Company had come to trade, not to take over. But in a land where power was breaking apart, where local leaders fought endless wars for land and control, the company found that army power was needed to keep business safe. Each win brought new jobs, new lands to rule, new people to control. The company's private army grew from a few hundred European soldiers and Indian sepoys to over 200,000 men. Its lands grew from a few coast trading towns to huge areas with millions of people. By 1850, the company ruled most of the Indian land either directly or through leaders they controlled. It was a government pretending to be a business, an empire pretending to be a company. The company's owners in London got money from the taxes paid by Indian farmers, while company workers in India got rich from cheating and private trading. But this system had the seeds of its own end. The company's rule was taking and herding, made to get the most money for owners instead of helping Indian people. Taxes were set so high that farmers had to grow things to sell instead of food to eat. Old work was destroyed by British factory things. Bad hungers became more common and worse as the old ways of saving and sharing grain were taken away. The company also got in the way of Indian religion in ways that made people very angry. British workers who thought they were better tried to fix what they saw as bad habits. They stopped sati, the burning of widows. They stopped thuggy, the killing done by some criminal groups. They built roads and trains that went through holy places and broke old travel paths. These changes were often really to help people, but they were forced without asking or agreement. To many Indians, they looked like attacks on their religion and ways, proof that the British wanted to make them all Christian and destroy their old life. The new Enfield rifle in 1857 gave the spark that lit this built-up anger. The new rifle bullets were said to be covered with cow and pig fat, bad for both Hindu and Muslim beliefs. When Indian soldiers were told to bite the bullets to load their rifles, many said no. What started as a soldier fight quickly grew to become a big rising against British rule. The fighters said they wanted the old Mughal Empire back and wanted all foreigners out. For over a year, much of northern India was fighting. British women and children were killed at Kanpur. The siege of Delhi lasted for months. The siege of Lucknow became a famous story of empire bravery and horror. The British answer was very cruel beyond words. Whole villages thought to help the fighters were burned down. Fighters were blown from cannons or hanged from trees. The payback was so bad that it shocked even some British people. General Neil's words were normal. The punishment I give is death, and I spare no one. But the rising also showed the strength of British rule. Most Indian soldiers stayed loyal to the company. The local kings that had deals with Britain mostly stayed out or helped the British. The fighting was only in northern India. The south and west stayed calm. When the rising was finally stopped, the British government decided that the East India Company could not be trusted to rule India anymore. The Government of India Act of 1858 moved control of India from the company to the Queen. Queen Victoria became Empress of India, and the land became the jewel in the empire crown. The new way of ruling was more in the center and better run than the company's way, but it was also farther away and stricter. The Indian civil service picked people by tests. Trained ruling, the Indian army changed with more British officers and fewer Indian soldiers gave safety. The train system grew fast after the rising gave both money growth and army control, but the new Raj also made new problems. The civil service, though trained, was almost all British. Indians were kept out of top jobs in their own government. The army, though strong, was an army to keep people down, made to stop risings, not fight outside enemies. The trains, though good for money, were built mostly to help British army and business needs. Most importantly, the Raj made a new group of educated Indians who knew both Western ideas and Indian problems. The schools started by the British made lawyers, doctors, teachers, and writers who could say Indian national feelings in words the British had taught them. Men like Dadabhai Naoroji used British money ideas to show that British rule was making India poor. They figured that Britain was taking money from India at millions of pounds each year, leaving the land poorer even with its good soil and hard-working people. Others like Bal Gangadhar Tilak used British ideas about democracy and ruling yourself to say that Indians had a right to rule themselves. If the British believed in government by the people, why should Indians not have people speaking for them in their own government? The Indian National Congress, started in 1885, at first only wanted small changes inside the empire system. Its early leaders were gentle men who believed that slow change was possible by talking and laws. They asked for more Indian people in government, for more Indian officers in the army, for keeping Indian work safe from British things. But the British answer was mostly no. The Raj did not want to share power with Indians, even educated Indians who had taken British ways and thinking. The government's feeling was said by Lord Curzon, Viceroy of India from 1899 to 1905. The Congress is falling apart, and one of my big dreams while in India is to help it die peacefully. This feeling hurt itself. By saying no to gentle Indian national feelings, the British made sure it would grow stronger and meaner. By treating all Indians as people to rule, not people with rights, they made a shared feeling among people who had before seen themselves as Bengalis, Marathas, or Tamils, not as Indians. The splitting of Bengal in 1905 was a turning point. Curzon split the area for ruling reasons, but Indians saw it as a plan to hurt Bengali national feelings by splitting Hindus and Muslims. The answer was huge. A stop buying of British things that spread across India together with the first real attacks on British rule. The Swadeshi movement, which pushed Indian-made things over British ones, showed that Indians could plan good money fighting back. The attacks, though small, showed that some Indians were ready to use fighting against British rule. The British had to undo the split in 1911, but the hurt was done. Indian national feelings had grown stronger. The First World War would finish this change. India helped Britain a huge amount in the war. Over 1 million Indian soldiers fought far away, and the Indian government gave hundreds of millions of pounds in money and things. Indians were told that they were fighting for freedom and government by the people, that their help would be paid back with self-rule. But when the war ended, the promised changes were very small. The Government of India Act of 1919 gave Indians a small part in area government, but kept real power in British hands. Worse, the Rowlatt Acts of 1919 gave the government power to arrest and keep Indians without a trial. The answer was the rise of Mahatma Gandhi as the leader of Indian national feelings. Gandhi's smart part was to join Western ideas about not following bad laws with Indian ways of peace and giving yourself for others. His ways were new, but his dreams were old-fashioned. He wanted to clean Indian society as much as to get rid of British rule. The non-cooperation movement of 1920 to 1922 saw millions of Indians stop helping British things. Students left government schools. Lawyers stopped using British courts. Voters said no to joining elections. It was the first big group movement in Indian history, and it showed that British rule needed Indian help in the end. The British answer was mixed and not clear. They switched between hurting people and giving things. Between thinking Gandhi was a dangerous fighter and a holy man who could be talked to. They never understood that Gandhi's power came not from his own charm, but from his skill at saying the dreams of millions of Indians who had stopped believing in British rule. By the 1920s, it was clear that the Raj did not have much time left. The question was not if India would become free, but when and how. The British could put off the sure thing with force and tricks, but they could not stop it. The jewel in the crown was falling from their hands, and with it the base of their world empire. By the 1870s, Britain faced a new and scary truth. Other countries were catching up. For most of the 1800s, Britain had what historians call the empire of free trade. The power to rule world markets with better factories and navy power without the cost of real colonies. But now other European countries were getting stronger, and the easy world of British being the best was breaking. Germany joined under Prussian leaders in 1871, was quickly making factories and building a strong navy. France, better after its bad loss in the Franco-Prussian War, was trying to get back pride through colonies. Russia was pushing south toward India and east toward the Pacific. Even small countries like Belgium were taking big colonies in Africa. The result was what historians call the scramble for Africa, the fastest and fullest taking of a continent in history. In 1870, Europeans ruled only 10% of Africa. By 1900, they ruled 90%. It was a crazy rush of empire. Dreams with European countries grabbing land as fast as they could map it. Britain's plan was to take the best lands before others could get them. The Cape Colony in South Africa controlled the seaway to India. Egypt controlled the Suez Canal, the fast way to the east. Nigeria controlled the palm oil trade. Kenya controlled the start of the Nile River. Each land was a part in a world puzzle, good not just for its own things, but for its place in the empire system. Cecil Rhodes, the diamond businessman who dreamed of building a train from Cape Town to Cairo, showed this new strong empire building. Rhodes believed that British growth was not just good for money, but needed that the Anglo-Saxon people had a job to civilize the world, and that more land under British rule meant more happiness for people. The British South Africa Company, started in 1889, was Rhodes's way for growth. Like the old East India Company, it was a private company with government powers, the right to make deals, keep armies, and rule lands. The company took what would become Rhodesia, adding 500,000 square miles to the empire. But the scramble for Africa brought Britain into fights with both European countries and African people who did not want to be ruled. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 tried to make rules for splitting Africa, but it was really just a way for European countries to divide the continent without fighting each other. The meeting made the rule of real control. European claims to African land had to be backed by real ruling and power. This started a race to make trading places, make deals with local leaders, and put flags in faraway parts of the continent. The Africans themselves were not asked. They were just problems to get past or friends to buy. The human cost of this rush was huge. The Congo Free State made by King Leopold of Belgium became a word for colony cruelty. The Belgian rulers used forced work to get rubber and ivory, killing millions of Congolese in the process. The German stopping of the Herero and Nama people in southwest Africa was killing a whole people by any meaning, wiping out whole groups. Britain's story was not much better. The taking of Sudan meant the planned breaking of the Mahdist state and the killing of its fighters at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. Winston Churchill, who fought in the battle as a young horse soldier, called it the greatest win ever got by the weapons of science over people they called barbarians. The Zulu War of 1879 saw British soldiers have a bad loss at Isandlwana before finally crushing Zulu fighting at Ulundi. The war was said to be to keep British settlers safe, but its real job was to destroy the last free African kingdom in southern Africa. Hardest of all were the Boer Wars in South Africa. The Boers, Dutch-speaking farmers who had been in South Africa for 200 years, had made free countries in the Transvaal and Orange Free State. When gold was found in the Transvaal in 1886, British wanting the area grew very strong. The Second Boer War, fought from 1899 to 1902, was Britain's hardest colony fight. The Boers, fighting on their homeland with better knowing of the ground, were strong enemies. They used surprise attacks that made British normal war hard. The British answer was to use a burn-everything plan, burning Boer farms and putting people into concentration camps. Over 26,000 Boer women and children died in these camps, mostly from sickness and not enough food. It was an early look at the total war that would mark the 1900s. The war cost Britain £200 million and needed 450,000 soldiers to beat 60,000 Boer fighters. It was a hard win that hurt Britain's good name in the world and showed the limits of empire power. The empire could still win wars, but only at huge cost and with ways that shocked the civilized world. Meanwhile, in Asia, Britain was facing new problems to its control. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 had made the way to India shorter, but it had also made the empire easier to hurt. The canal was run by a French company, and France stayed Britain's biggest enemy in the area. The British answer was to buy most of the canal company in 1875, using money borrowed from the Rothschild bank family. It was a smart move that gave Britain control of the most important water road in the world, but it also made Britain have to guard Egypt, which controlled the canal's south end. The Egyptian problem of 1882 made Britain choose between its money needs and its free-thinking rules. A national rising led by Colonel Ahmed Urabi threatened to take over the pro-British government and take the canal. Britain could have let Egypt be free, but that would have meant losing control of the way to India. Instead, Britain attacked Egypt and made a hidden protectorate that would last until 1956. The taking was supposed to be short, but short takings have a way of becoming forever. Egypt became another part in the empire puzzle, good not for itself, but for its place. The same way was used all over the world. Britain took lands not because it wanted them, but because it could not let other countries have them. The empire was becoming hurt by its own winning, forced to grow to guard what it already had. By 1900, the British Empire covered 11 million square miles and ruled 400 million people. It was the biggest empire in history, but it was also getting too big and costly to keep. The cost of guarding so many lands was hurting the British money, while the hard job of ruling so many different people was too much for the empire workers. More worrying, the empire was making its own enemies. Every growth made fighting back. Every new land brought new jobs. Every win made new weak spots. The empire that had been built by taking chances and smart changes was becoming a stiff system that could not change with new times. The rush for everything had given Britain the world, but it had also given the world reasons to hate Britain. The empire was near its highest point, but the things that would destroy it were already getting stronger. In the mountains and deserts between the Russian and British empires, a different kind of war was happening. A war of spies and talkers, of exploring in secret plans, of chess games played across thousands of miles of some of the hardest land on Earth. This was the Great Game, the 100-year fight between Britain and Russia for control of Central Asia and power over the ways to India. The game started with fear. British workers in India looking north toward the tall peaks of the Hindu Kush, and the Himalayas saw not natural walls but roads for attack. Beyond those mountains was the huge Russian Empire, growing southward with what looked like unstoppable power. Every Russian move into the Caucasus, into Central Asia, toward the edges of Afghanistan was seen as a step toward the big prize. India, the jewel in the British crown. Russian workers looking south from their new lands in Central Asia saw British power spreading northward from India. Like a slow poison, British spies were working in Afghanistan, Persia, and Tibet. British money was paying local leaders who might have been Russian friends. British maps were drawing lands that Russia thought were theirs. Both empires were pushed by the same thinking. In a world where big countries fought for world control, no one could stay out. Every land that was not under your power could be under your enemy's power. Every local leader who was not your friend could be your enemy's friend. The great game was not just about land. It was about the balance of power in Asia and finally the world. The people in this game were amazing men, soldiers, talkers, explorers, and spies who worked in some of the most dangerous and faraway places on Earth. On the British side, there were men like Alexander Burns, who went dressed as a trader through Afghanistan and Central Asia, mapping lands and checking the loyalty of local leaders. There was Arthur Connolly, who made up the name Great Game and died badly in a prison in Bukhara. There was Francis Younghusband, who led an army trip to Tibet and forced the Dalai Lama to sign a deal opening the country to British power. On the Russian side, there were men like Nikolai Prjevalsky, the explorer who mapped huge parts of Central Asia and Tibet while getting information for the Russian government. There was Mikhail Skobelev, the general who took the Central Asian Khanates with a mix of smart fighting and mean cruelty. There was Count Nikolai Ignatiev, the talker who made deals that pushed Russian power deep into Asia. These men were playing for the biggest prizes possible. If Russia could make a safe road to the Indian Ocean, it would break Britain's sea power and hurt the base of the British Empire. If Britain could make a wall of friendly countries between Russia and India, it could guard its most important land and keep its world control. Afghanistan became the main battlefield of the Great Game. This mountain tribal country controlled the roads between Central Asia and India. Whoever ruled Afghanistan could hurt the other's empire. But Afghanistan was also one of the hardest countries in the world to take and keep, a graveyard of empires where foreign armies went to die. The first Afghan war fought from 1839 to 1842 was a disaster for Britain. A British army of 16,000 men was almost all killed during the pullback from Kabul, with only one European making it to safety in British land. The killing shocked the British people and showed the limits of empire power, but the British learned from their mistakes. The Second Afghan War fought from 1878 to 1880 was more successful. British soldiers took Kabul and forced the Afghan ruler to take a British person living there and British control of Afghan outside matters. Afghanistan became a wall country, said to be free but really under British power. The Great Game was not just fought in Afghanistan. In Persia, British and Russian spies fought for power over the Shah and his workers. The country was split into areas of power, with Russia strong in the north and Britain strong in the south. The Persian government, caught between two big powers, played them against each other while slowly losing control of its own land. In Tibet, the British were worried about Russian power over the Dalai Lama. The Younghusband trip of 1903 to 1904 forced its way to Lhasa and made the Tibetan government sign a deal keeping out foreign power and opening the country to British trade. It was a hard fight at heights where men could hardly breathe, but it made Tibet a British area of power. The Great Game was also fought through helpers and friends. The British gave the Emir of Afghanistan money and guns, while the Russians helped different Central Asian leaders who did not like British growth. Both empires used local fights to help their own needs, turning area problems into parts of their world fight. But the Great Game could not be won forever. Neither empire could get a full win without risking a big war that might wreck both. The distances were too big, the land too hard, the local people too against foreign rule. Both empires were stretched too far, spending huge money to keep places that were important for plans but not for money. The game started to slow down in the early 1900s as both empires faced new problems. Russia was hurt by its loss in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 and by the Revolution of 1905. Britain was more worried about the growing power of Germany and the need to keep its soldiers closer to home. The Anglo-Russian Agreement of 1907 ended the Great Game by splitting Persia into areas of power and saying Britain was the main one in Afghanistan. Both empires agreed to leave Tibet alone, though this did not mean much since neither could really control it. The Great Game had lasted for almost 100 years and had cost both empires huge money and thousands of lives. It had brought modern ways to some of the most faraway places on Earth, but it had also brought war, taking advantage and breaking cultures. It had shown the world reach of European empire building, but it had also shown its limits. Most importantly, the Great Game had shown that the time of easy empire growth was ending. The world was full of fighting empires, and future fights would be more dangerous and more breaking than anything before. The British Empire had won the Great Game, but it had also learned that winning in one place might mean losing in another. The empire was near its biggest size and biggest weakness. The Great Game was over, but the bigger game, the fight for world control in the 1900s, was just starting. By the middle of the 1800s, Britain had become something never seen in history, a country that could make things faster and cheaper than anyone else, then use its sea power to force open markets all over the world. The smoking chimneys of Manchester and Birmingham had become the power of empire, making the money that paid for the armies and navies that took the world. The change could be seen everywhere you looked. The green fields of England were being covered with red brick factories. The clear rivers were running black with factory waste. The old ways of country life were being changed by the exact timing of the factory way. Britain was becoming the workshop of the world, and the world was becoming Britain's market. Steam was the main power of this change. Steam engines pumped water from coal mines, letting people dig deeper and get more coal. Steam-powered cloth factories made cloth faster than groups of hand weavers. Steam trains carried things across the country at speeds never seen. Steam-powered ships let Britain travel without waiting for wind or weather, letting them go all year to every part of the world. The numbers were amazing. By 1850, Britain was making half the world's iron and two-thirds of its coal. British factories were making more cotton cloth than the rest of the world together. British shipbuildings were making more ships than all other countries put together. British traders were doing business in every port from Liverpool to Hong Kong, but this factory winning came at a human cost that was almost too big to count. The new factory towns were terrible places of dirt, too many people, and sickness. Workers did 14 hours a day in places that would have shocked old-time slaves. Children as young as 6 worked in cloth factories, their small fingers good for fixing broken threads. Women worked in match factories, their faces turning green from poison that would kill them later. Friedrich Engels, who would later work with Karl Marx on the Communist Manifesto, called the working areas of Manchester a hell on earth. The air was full of smoke and bad chemicals. The streets were open toilets. Whole families lived in one room without windows or air. Life in the factory cities was half as long as in the country, yet this way of hurting people was also a way of freeing them. The factory workers, however bad their lives, were free in ways that farmers had never been. They could quit their jobs, move to other cities, start groups, ask for better pay. The factory way made not just money, but also the working people that would later fight the whole money system of rich owners. The money made by British factories flowed out through the empire like blood in the body. Raw things flowed in from the colonies: cotton from India and America, wool from Australia, wood from Canada, sugar from the Caribbean. These things were made into products in British factories and sold back to the colonies as finished things for huge profit. This way of empire trade was forced by the Royal Navy, which had become the strongest fleet in history. British warships watched every ocean, keeping British traders safe and scaring possible enemies. The Navy's job was simple: keep the sea roads open for British trade and closed to everyone else when needed. The Opium Wars with China showed perfectly how this way worked in real life. Chinese empire, proud and able to take care of itself, did not want many British factory things. The Chinese had silk, tea, and porcelain that Europeans wanted badly, but they did not need European things back. This made a trade problem that took silver out of Britain. But British traders had found one thing that Chinese people wanted badly: opium grown in British-controlled India. The drug business was very good for money. Opium cost almost nothing to grow, but sold for huge amounts in Chinese markets. Soon millions of Chinese were hooked, and silver was flowing out of China to pay for the drug. When the Chinese government tried to stop opium coming in to save its people from the drug, Britain went to war to keep the drug trade. It was empire building at its worst, using army power to make a free country accept a trade that was hurting its people. But from the British view, it was simply business. Free trade was a good thing, and anyone who said no was standing in the way of progress and civilization. The same thinking was used everywhere the British flag was planted. In India, old clothwork was destroyed by British machine-made cloth. In Africa, local ironwork was ended by cheap British things. In Latin America, British traders used their money. Power to rule markets, even in countries that were said to be free. This money empire building was often more effective than military conquest. Why spend money on armies and leaders when you could get the same result through trade? British goods were simply better and cheaper than local products. British money could pay for railways and telegraphs that opened up new markets. British knowledge could modernize old-fashioned economies and make them produce more. But this system also created its own problems. The more successful British factories became, the more they created rivals. Other countries began to build factories using British machines and British money. Germany, the United States, and Japan were all copying the British way and starting to beat Britain at its own game. The schools that Britain built in its colonies trained local leaders who understood both Western machines and their own people's needs. These men could fight against British rule better than old-style leaders who did not know modern ways. The railways and telegraphs that Britain built to control its empire also let anti-British ideas spread faster than ever before. Most dangerously, British factory success was creating a new kind of society, city living, able to read, aware of politics, and harder to control with old methods. The workers who ran the machines that made the empire rich were also learning to form unions, political parties, and rebel groups. By the end of the 1800s, Britain's lead in factories was starting to slip. Other countries were catching up, using newer machines and smarter ways. The workshop of the world was becoming just one factory among many. The empire that had been built on factory power would have to find new ways to stay on top. But the thinking habits created by 100 years of being the best were hard to change. British leaders kept believing that their country was naturally better, that their empire was good for the world, that their control was both sure to last and helpful to everyone. This confidence would turn out to be both their greatest strength and their deadly weakness in the troubles that were coming. By the start of the 1900s, the British Empire had done something no one in history had ever done before. It ruled almost 400 million people across 11 million square miles, with lands on every continent and in every ocean. The sun never set on the British flag, and British power seemed as lasting as the ocean waves. But this huge empire was also becoming a heavy load that was slowly crushing the country that built it. The cost of protecting so many places was hurting the British economy. The difficulty of ruling so many different peoples was too much for the government workers, and the very success of the empire was creating the reasons for its own end. The problem was not just size, though size was part of it. How do you rule an empire that stretches from the frozen lands of Canada to the hot jungles of Burma, from the sheep farms of Australia to the diamond mines of South Africa? How do you make the same rules for people as different as Scottish mountain people and Indian farmers, Canadian woodcutters, and Egyptian farmers? The British answer was to rule through many different systems. Some places like Canada and Australia could govern themselves with their own leaders and parliaments. Others like India were ruled directly by British officials. Still others like the prince-ruled states of India or the protected lands of Africa were ruled through local kings who accepted British control. This system worked in a way, but it was very expensive and getting harder to keep up. Indian government service needed thousands of British workers, all of whom had to be found, trained, sent overseas, and paid. The Indian Army needed hundreds of thousands of soldiers, both British and Indian, to keep order and guard the borders. The Royal Navy needed hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of sailors to guard the sea roads and protect British trade. The money cost was huge. By 1900, Britain was spending over 40% of its government money on the military, most of it for the empire. The cost of the Second Boer War alone, £200 million, was more than the whole yearly budget of the British government just 50 years before. But the real weight of empire was not money. It was moral and in the mind. The British had told themselves that their empire was different from all earlier empires, that it was a force for good in the world, a mission to bring progress and light to less advanced peoples. This belief was key to how they saw themselves as a nation and why they thought it was right to rule others. Yet, the truth of ruling was often cruel and unfair. The crushing of the Indian Rebellion in 1857 had included killings and terrible acts that shocked even tough soldiers. The takeover of Sudan had ended with the killing of thousands of brave warriors at Omdurman. The prison camps of the Boer War had killed tens of thousands of women and children. These opposite truths created a kind of confused thinking in the British mind. They really believed that they were bringing civilization to the world, yet they had to use uncivilized ways to keep control. They talked about the good of free trade while using guns to force open markets. They spoke of the rule of law while ruling through emergency rules and army law. The weight of explaining these opposite things fell heavily on the government workers, soldiers, and settlers who lived with the daily truth of colony rule. Many of them felt what Rudyard Kipling called the white man's burden, a feeling of duty and giving up comfort that helped them feel okay about their job in the empire. Kipling's poem from 1899 captured this thinking perfectly. Take up the white man's burden. Forth the bestie breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught, sullen peoples, half devil and half child. This was not fake talk, it was real belief. Many British officials truly saw themselves as helpers of mankind, giving up their own comfort and safety to bring order and progress to wild and less advanced places. They built railways and hospitals, started schools and courts, stopped fights between tribes and groups. But this father-like attitude was also very racist and looking down on others. It thought that non-European people could not rule themselves, that they needed British help to become civilized, that their own ways and traditions were problems to get rid of instead of good things to keep. This thinking was made stronger by the fake science racism that was popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Social Darwinism said that the British had grown to a higher level than other races, that their control was natural and sure to happen. Studies of people and cultures gave what seemed like science reasons for treating different people as truly different and not equal. The result was a system of race levels that was part of every part of empire life. In India, British officials lived in separate areas, went to separate clubs, and only mixed with other Europeans. In Africa, white settlers were given the best land, while Africans were forced onto small reserves. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples were treated as a dying race whose end was both sure to happen and a good thing. This race system was not just everyday habit, it was forced by law. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, known as the White Australia Policy, kept non-European people from moving to Australia. Similar laws in South Africa limited the movement and rights of the African majority. Even in Britain itself, there were quiet but strong walls that stopped colony people from being fully equal. But the empire was also making the tools of its own end. The schools started by the British-made colony leaders who knew both Western ideas and local problems. Men like Mahatma Gandhi in India, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya were all taught in British schools who used that teaching against British rule. The travel and message systems built to control the empire, railways, telegraphs, steamships, also let anti-empire ideas spread faster than ever before. Freedom movements in different colonies could learn from each other, plan together, and stand as one against British rule. Most importantly, the growth pushed by the empire made new groups of people with the money and teamwork to fight British control. Indian shop owners and factory bosses, African mine workers, Caribbean sugar workers, all of these groups grew their own wishes that often went against empire rules. By the early 1900s, the British Empire was like a huge machine that still ran well, but needed more and more fuel to keep going. The machine was still strong, still amazing, still able to crush any single fight against it, but it was also getting more expensive to run and harder to explain why it was good. The weight of empire was getting heavier every year. And the British were starting to ask if the good parts were worth the cost. The empire that had once been a source of power was becoming a source of weakness, a promise that Britain could neither drop nor pay to keep. The stage was set for the great trouble that would test the empire's strength and show its deep problems. That trouble would come in the form of 2 world wars that would use up Britain's money and break its belief in its empire job. When the guns of August 1914 started to fire across Europe, few people knew that they were watching the beginning of the end of the British Empire, the Great War, as it came to be called would test the empire's strength as nothing had before, showing both its amazing staying power and its deadly weaknesses. At first, the war seemed to prove the empire's togetherness and strength. From every part of the world, British people rushed to the flag. Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa joined the war against Germany within days of Britain's choice. India sent over 1 million soldiers to fight. Even the smallest colonies gave what they could, men, money, and supplies for the fight against the Central Powers. The answer was amazing: young men. From the wheat farms of Saskatchewan and the sheep farms of New South Wales marched off to fight in the trenches of France and Belgium. Indian army groups served on the Western Front, in Mesopotamia, and in East Africa. South African forces took German Southwest Africa. Australian and New Zealand troops landed at Gallipoli in one of the war's most famous and sad battles. But this worldwide call-up came at a price that would in the end kill the empire: the war cost. Britain over £37 billion, more than the whole wealth of the country at the start of the fighting. The national debt grew by over 1,000%. Britain, which had been the world's moneylender, became the world's borrower, owing huge amounts to the United States. More importantly, the war broke the story of European better than everyone that had been key to empire thinking. The civilized nations of Europe had torn each other apart with a wildness that shocked the world. Poison gas, machine guns, and giant guns had turned the Western Front into a place of death where millions died for land gains measured in yards. The colony people who had been told they were fighting for civilization and democracy saw European civilization destroying itself. Indian soldiers who served in France wrote home about the terrible things they had seen. African workers who carried supplies for British forces in East Africa saw white men killing each other with factory speed. The moral power of the white race, already not perfect, was hurt more by the sight of Europeans destroying themselves. The war also sped up political changes that had been growing for years in India. The help given in the war created hopes for political change that the British did not want to give. The Government of India Act of 1919 gave Indians a small part in local government, but it was far less than the self-rule that many had hoped for as a thank you for their help. The Rowlatt Acts of 1919, which let the government arrest and hold Indians without a trial, seemed to show that British promises of change were empty. The answer was the rise of Mahatma Gandhi as the leader of Indian freedom with his new idea of peaceful fighting back. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre of April 13, 1919 became a turning point in British-Indian friendship. General Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to shoot at an unarmed crowd gathered in a walled garden in Amritsar, killing at least 379 people and hurting over 1,000. Dyer's action was protected by many British officials as needed to keep order, but it shocked Indian people and ended whatever was left of Indian trust in British fairness. The massacre showed the ugly truth behind the nice words of empire kindness. When their power was questioned, the British were ready to use the same cruel ways as any other empire power. Too much force used without pity or care. The job of bringing civilization was shown to be just a thin cover over the hard hand of army rule. Similar things happened across the empire. In Ireland, the Easter Rising of 1916 had been crushed with quick cruelty, but it had also made a new group of freedom heroes. The killing of the rising leaders turned them into heroes and made Irish people turn against British rule. Irish War of Independence, fought from 1919 to 1921, ended with the splitting of Ireland and the making of the Irish Free State. In Egypt, the Revolution of 1919 forced Britain to give almost independence in 1922, though British troops stayed to guard the Suez Canal. In Iraq, a big rebellion in 1920 needed huge army help to stop. Even in the self-ruling parts, there were signs of wanting more freedom. Canada signed the Treaty of Versailles on its own, showing its right to make its own friends and enemies. The war had also shown the empire's weak defense spots. The German submarine attacks had almost starved Britain by cutting the sea roads that held the empire together. The danger to the Suez Canal had shown how easily the road to India could be cut. The friendship with Japan needed to guard British interests in the Pacific was getting less trustworthy as Japan wanted its own empire. Most worrying, the war had sped up the rise of new powers that fought British control. The United States had become the world's top factory and money power. The Soviet Union, even with its own troubles, offered a new idea against the empire system. Japan was becoming the strongest power in East Asia. Germany, though beaten, still had the factories to fight Britain again. The British answer to these dangers was mixed and unclear. Some leaders, like Winston Churchill, believed that the empire could be kept by strength and will. Others, like the money expert John Maynard Keynes, said that the money base of empire was falling apart and that Britain needed to find new ways to stay important in the world. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921 to 1922 showed Britain's lower place. For the first time in over 100 years, Britain agreed to have the same size navy as another power, the United States. The Royal Navy, which had been the base of British power for 300 years, was no longer the strongest. The empire that came out of the Great War was still huge and strong, but it was also completely changed. The easy belief of the Victorian years of Queen Victoria was gone, replaced by a growing knowing of the empire's limits and weak spots. The war had been won, but at a cost that made people ask if the empire could live through another one. The crack in the base had shown, and it would only grow with time. The British Empire had reached its biggest size ever. The pink on the map would never be bigger than it was in the 1920s. But the forces that would finally pull it apart were already getting stronger, and the next big trouble would show just how breakable the world's greatest empire had become. The 1920s and 30s were the empire's last warm days, a time of seeming calm and still growing that hid the deep changes that were slowly breaking British power. On the outside, the empire looked as strong as ever. The map was still painted pink from Canada to Australia, from India to South Africa. British government workers still ruled hundreds of millions of people. The Royal Navy still guarded the world's oceans, but under this show of strength, the empire was slowly dying. The money base of British power was falling apart. The moral right that had made empire rule seem okay was being questioned, and new ideas, nationalism, communism, fascism, were fighting the whole empire idea. The money crisis was the closest danger. The Great War had changed Britain from the world's money lender to the world's borrower. The country owed huge amounts to the United States, and the interest payments alone took a big part of the government money. The pound, which had been the world's main money for over 100 years, was always in danger. British factories, which had once ruled world markets, were losing to factories in the United States, Germany, and Japan. The old main businesses, cloth, coal, steel, shipmaking, were getting weaker, unable to beat newer and better makers. No job times were normal, reaching over 3 million during the worst years of the money crash. The empire, which had once been a source of money, was becoming a costly weight. The cost of guarding India alone took over half of Britain's army money. The self-ruling parts were less and less ready to pay for empire defense, wanting to spend their money on their own needs. The colonies, which had once bought only British goods, were building their own factories and needing fewer British things. The political problems were even worse. Across the empire, freedom movements were getting stronger and smarter. In India, the Indian National Congress had grown from a gentle group asking for slow change to a huge movement demanding full freedom. Mahatma Gandhi's fights of peaceful rule-breaking had shown that the British rulers could be fought without guns. The Salt March of 1930 was a perfect show of politics. Gandhi's 240-mile walk to the sea to make salt against the British salt rule caught the world's attention and showed how wrong empire rule looked. How could the British say it was right to arrest an old man for making salt from seawater? The Government of India Act of 1935 tried to answer Indian wishes through a hard system of local power and countrywide government, but it was too little, too late. The act made neither British old thinkers happy who saw it as a dangerous gift to Indian freedom, nor Indian freedom fighters who saw it as a trick to split and rule. Similar things were happening across the empire. In Burma, the freedom movement was growing under leaders like Aung San. In Ceylon, the Donoughmore Constitution of 1931 gave some self-rule, but did not give enough to freedom hopes. In the Middle East, the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 fought British rule in Palestine, while freedom movements in Egypt and Iraq asked for more freedom. Even in the self-ruling parts, there were signs of wanting to stand alone. The Balfour Declaration of 1926 said the self-ruling parts were equals of Britain not under Britain, changing the heart of the empire family. The Statute of Westminster of 1931 gave the self-ruling parts full lawmaking freedom, really ending the law-togetherness of the empire. The rise of fascism and communism gave new idea fights to the empire system. The Soviet Union showed another way to grow that many colony people liked, especially thinkers and workers who got none of the good from empire rule. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany fought British power straight, hurting the sea road to India and the safety of the empire's African lands, the Abyssinian crisis of 1935 showed the empire's weakness against strong attack. When Mussolini took Ethiopia, Britain could not stop him well. The League of Nations put punishments, but they did not work without America and Germany joining. The crisis showed that Britain could no longer be the world's police without help from other big countries. The Munich crisis of 1938 showed how far British power had fallen. Neville Chamberlain's peacegiving was not just a moral mistake. It was knowing that Britain could not fight a big war without friends. The empire that had once been able to fight on many sides at once was now having trouble guarding its own home. The start of the Second World War in September 1939 was the true beginning of the end for the British Empire. Unlike the First World War, which had been mostly in Europe, this was a real-world fight that would test every part of empire power. The early years of the war were terrible for British pride. The fall of France in June 1940 left Britain alone against Nazi Germany. The Battle of Britain saved the home islands from attack, but it also showed how open the empire had become. The Blitz showed that British cities could be bombed without stop, breaking the story of never being hurt that had been key to empire thinking. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1940 brought the United States into the war, but it also brought Japan to fight the British Empire. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 was maybe the worst blow to British pride in the empire's history. The fortress that could not be taken fell to a Japanese army that was supposed to be weaker than European forces. The giving up of over 100,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops at Singapore broke the story of white better than others that had been key to empire rule. If the British could not protect their own lands against an Asian power, how could they say they were the natural rulers of Asia? The Japanese taking of Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and much of the Pacific showed that the age of European empires was ending. The old empires were being pushed away by new forces that they could not understand or control. The British Empire, which had seemed so lasting and strong just a few years before, was shown to be as able to die as any other human thing. The war would finally be won, but at a cost that would make keeping the empire impossible. The Britain that came out of the Second World War would be a very different country from the one that had gone in, poor, tired, and needing American help to stay alive. The end of the gods had started, and there would be no new morning after. The Second World War was the British Empire's last big win and its final loss. When the guns stopped in August 1945, Britain stood with the winners, its flag still flying over huge lands. Its pride seeming okay, but the war had used up the empire's life, leaving it an empty shell that would fall apart within one generation. The numbers told the story of empire tiredness. Britain had spent over £28 billion on the war, more than the whole wealth of the country in 1939. The national debt had tripled. The country's gold was gone, used to buy American guns and food. Britain, which had started the war as a moneylender country, came out as the world's biggest borrower, more hurtful than the money cost was the people cost. Over 450,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers had died in the war. Whole cities had been turned to rocks by German bombs. The trading ships, the lifeline of the empire, had lost over 30,000 men and 4,000 ships to enemy attacks. But the real hurt was in the mind. The war had broken the story of British never losing that had been key to empire rule. The fall of Singapore, the running from Burma, the almost losing of the Middle East, all had shown that the British were not the never-beaten people they had said they were. The colony people who had been told they were fighting for freedom and fair voting took those words for real. Indian soldiers who had fought in Burma and Italy came home with new thoughts about their rights and power. African soldiers who had served in the Middle East and Far East came back with a bigger view of the world and their place in it. The war had also sped up people and political changes that made the old empire system impossible to keep. The Labour Party's win in the 1945 vote brought to power men who were doubtful of empire and wanted change at home. Clement Attlee, the new leader, had long thought that the empire was an old-fashioned thing that took money from home needs. The new government had an impossible choice: keep the empire or rebuild Britain. The country simply did not have the money to do both. The choice was made easier by the growing power of freedom movements across the empire and the lower war value of many empire lands. India was the first and most important piece to fall. The Indian National Congress and the Muslim League had both helped the war, but they had done so knowing that freedom would come after winning. When the war ended, they were not ready to wait anymore. The cabinet team of 1946 tried to find a way to keep India one, but the growing hate between Hindus and Muslims made this impossible. The call for Pakistan, a separate country for the area's Muslims, could not be stopped. Splitting became sure to happen even with its terrible people cost. Lord Mountbatten, the last British ruler of India, was given the impossible job of giving power while keeping peace. The splitting of India in August 1947 was joined by fighting between groups that killed over 1 million people and forced 12 million to leave their homes. It was a sad end to the brightest jewel in the crown, but it was also knowing that the age of empire was over. The loss of India was followed by a rush of freedom across the empire. Burma became free in January 1948, followed by Ceylon in February. Palestine, which had become impossible to rule because of the fight between Jews and Arabs, was given to the United Nations in May 1948. The same thing happened across Africa and Asia. Ghana became free in 1957, followed by Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963, and dozens of other places in the years after. By the 1970s, the British Empire had shrunk to a few small islands and places that were too small or too far to be real countries on their own. The giving freedom was not always peaceful. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, the Malayan emergency, the Cyprus trouble, the Suez mistake, all showed that the British were ready to fight to keep their empire, but they also showed that such fights were, in the end, useless. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was maybe the most shaming moment in the empire's fall. When President Nasser of Egypt took the Suez Canal, Britain and France sent armies to take it back. The army part worked, but the politics failed. The United States and Soviet Union both said no to the attack, and Britain was forced to leave in shame. Suez showed that Britain could no longer act as a great power without American okay. The special friendship with the United States, which had started during the war, became one of needing rather than sharing. Britain was lowered to being America's smaller helper, a job that many found hard to take. The money base of empire was also falling. The sterling area, which had been the money heart of the empire, was hurt by many money troubles. The pound was made cheaper in 1949 and again in 1967. The choice to let the pound find its own price in 1972 marked the end of the pound as a world money. British factories, which had once ruled world sales, were losing to makers in Germany, Japan, and the new growing countries of Asia. The old empire markets were no longer forced to buy British. Old colonies could now trade with whoever gave the best deal. The Commonwealth, which was meant to keep money ties between Britain and its old colonies, became just a place to talk. By the 1970s, it was clear that the British Empire was over. The pink on the map had faded to a few small spots. The Royal Navy, which had once ruled the seas, was now only guarded the coast. The country that had once ruled a quarter of the world's people was having trouble ruling itself. The empire's end was not one big moment, but a slow knowing that the age of European empires was finished. The things that had made the empire, factory-led, sea control, better machines, had been shared around the world. Other countries could now do what Britain had once done alone. The final count had come, and it was final. The greatest empire in human history had lasted for less than 400 years, a short time in the long story of people. It had changed the world for good and bad, but it had also changed itself out of being. The British Empire was dead, but its memory would live on in the language, laws, and ways of doing things it had spread around the world. The question now was, what would take its place in the world order it had made? Today, if you walk through the streets of London, you can still see the shadows of empire everywhere. The grand buildings of Whitehall, where the Colony Office once ruled a quarter of the world. The statues of empire heroes in Trafalgar Square and Parliament Square. The museums filled with treasures taken from every part of the earth. The very names of the streets, India House, Australia House, Canada House, speak of a time when London was the center of the world. But the empire itself is gone as the Roman armies or the Mongol riders. The pink has faded from the map, replaced by the flags of free countries. The Royal Navy that once ruled the waves has been cut to a few ships. The country that once ruled 400 million people now finds it hard to rule 67 million. Yet the memory of empire lives on in ways we can see and ways we cannot, good ways and bad ways. The English language spread by empire fighting and trade has become the world's shared tongue. The law systems of many countries are based on English common law. The voting democracy started in Westminster has been copied with changes around the world. The money system made by the empire, world buying and selling based on free trade and moving money, has become the main way people organize. The message. Networks built to control the empire have grown into the internet that joins the world. The science and machine advances that gave Britain its empire power have become the shared property of all people. But the empire's memory is not all good. The random borders drawn by empire workers have become reasons for fighting from the Middle East to Africa. The race levels made to make empire rules seem right have left deep hurts on people around the world. The taking of wealth that made Britain rich made many of its old colonies poor, making patterns of being behind that are still here today. The splitting of India, the making of Israel, the fake countries of Africa, all carry the mark of empire choices that put British needs over local truth. The results of these choices still shape world politics, making fights that have lasted for many years. Perhaps most importantly, the British Empire made the pattern for today's world joining, world money together, people and ideas moving across borders, the making of world groups. All of these have their start in the empire system that Britain built. But the empire also showed the limits of power and the sure coming of change. No matter how strong an empire gets, no matter how forever it looks, it carries inside the seeds of its own end. Success makes people lazy, growing too big makes you too thin, and the very things that make empire finally turn against it. The British learned this lesson the hard way. Their empire fell not because of one big loss, but because of a slow eating away of the base of their power. Money fall, army too spread, freedom fighting, and changing world ways all worked together to make the empire impossible to keep. The same things that killed the British Empire are working today. The United States, which took Britain's place as the top world power, faces many of the same problems that ended its teacher. Money fight from growing powers, army promises around the world, home political fights, and changing world rules all hurt American top place. China, which suffered under British empire ways for over 100 years, is now rising as a possible next top power. The Belt and Road Plan, China's big idea to join Asia, Africa, and Europe with roads and trains, looks a lot like the empire roads that once joined the British Empire. But the world has changed since the age of European empires. The old ways of control, army takeover, money taking, race levels, are no longer okay or useful. New empires must be built on different ground. Money joining, new machines, culture power, and world working together. The British Empire was a child of its time, shaped by the special facts of the 1700s and 1800s. It could not have been without the factory change, the science change, and the special world balance that gave Britain its short lead. That world is gone, and it will not come back. The future belongs to different ways of grouping, different ways of using power, different friendships between peoples and countries. The age of empire is over, but the human wish to make order, to make connections, to use power across big spaces goes on. The British Empire was both the greatest win and the greatest sadness of the new age. It joined the world as never before, spreading ideas, machines, and ways of doing things that have helped all people. But it also used and hurt millions of people, making race and country levels that have hurt human friendship for years. Understanding this history is needed to understand our world today. The world money, the world system, the ways of growing and staying behind that shape our world. Today all have their start in the Empire Age. We cannot know where we are without knowing where we came from. The British Empire is dead, but its shadows still walk with us. They speak in the languages we use, the laws we follow, the groups we live in. They remind us that all human things are for a time, that all empires go up and down, that the only thing that never changes in history is change itself. The sun has finally set on the British Empire, but it has risen on a new world that the empire helped to make. Whether that world will be better or worse than what came before is still to be seen, but one thing is sure. The age of empire is over, and the age of something else has begun. The story of the British Empire is the story of human wanting and human mistakes, of great wins and terrible wrongs, of the rise and fall of great groups. It is a story that shows us both what humans can do and what humans cannot do. In the end, perhaps that is the biggest lesson of all, that no empire, no matter how great, lasts forever. The British learned this lesson, as the Romans learned it before them, as the Americans may learn it in their time. Power is for a time, but the human story goes on. The British Empire took the world, but the world in the end took the British Empire. And in that taking, perhaps, lies the seed of a better tomorrow for all people.